I'd do a little something different. Come to you from a different setting, add some ominous music. Hi, Comma and Sexuality students. It's your crazy Professor Ivy. Hope you're doing okay. I didn't mean to be silly on a time when I'm talking about kind of a tough topic, but I just thought it'd be funny to give you a different look. Yeah, behind me is a cabinet that I inherited from my mother. It's very fancy. It's not really my style, but I love it. Most of the things in there are hers. I lost her. She passed away in 2013. God love her. God miss her every day. But anyway, so I'm in my house. I'm in my living room. And what you just heard was me playing the first opening ominous notes from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So I'm sitting at my black baby grand piano. I don't mean to sound like a braggart, but I do love the thing. And it's been good company since I'm cut off from you. So anyway, I just thought I'd pick a different setting, find something else to do. Come from somewhere else other than my office. I hope you're doing okay. I know there's a lot going on. I know you're overloaded. I wish I could be with you instead of, making these videos, these little movies and things about, the stuff we're reading. But anyway, here goes. So we have to talk about an important topic, another important topic. Golly, there's not much frivolous to talk about in a common sexuality class. But I am the reading reporter assigned to Chapter 3 in the Jimmy Manning Reader. And so when we get to some of these really tough topics, I felt like I didn't want to assign them to anybody to cover. There are challenging topics to cover just because of the nature of what we're talking about. It's sensitive and intimate, and sometimes things you're not used to talking about in a college classroom. So I know that. But also, if you heard I did another recording about Chapter 7 in the Gender Speak book. And so I had to talk about sexual assault in there, and then there was another one on consent in there, and then the last one was on partner violence, an audio recording. I sent you that. I sent both the gender comm class and the common sexuality class now. So we are done with what we were going to do in the Gender Speak book, at least for this common sexuality class, okay? So you saw me talk about people being triggered and about trigger words and trigger topics. And so my big hope while I'm talking about this tonight, because we're going to be talking about sexual assault and rape culture and what that means, consent, what that means. I don't want anybody to be triggered either because you've had your own experiences or you know of traumatic experiences that have happened to others that you care about. But we have to talk about these things. So some of you may never see this tape. Some of you may get partially through it a little bit and then decide, yeah, I'm good. Or you just don't have the time, and that's okay. We're just all doing the best we can. I do want to tell you that this chapter, and it starts on page 35, and the author is Larissa Bryan. I think it is one of the best chapters in the whole Manning book, okay? So it's Chapter 3, Genealogy of Sexual Consent. That means how have we understood sexual consent over a long stretch of history. I didn't know this stuff before I read it, and it has really informed and educated me. It takes us from the time that women really did not have sexual consent. They were considered the property of their husbands. And then it moves us through the suffragists, where in the 1800s, they were working toward changing thinking about women, that women were human beings. Women didn't get the right to vote till 1920, right? Here in this very weird year of 2020 that started off so promising, we've now hit 100 years of women having the right to vote. Some other things haven't changed as much as that one thing has. But this moves us through feminism, second wave feminism, which is sort of my wave, sometimes called women's liberation, and talks just about how the notion of consent to sexual activity is still evolving today, and it is. So I am looking at page 36, where they talk about consent first as a form of silence, that silence, a woman not saying anything, was her form of consent. And wow, consent as silence is kind of mind-boggling, right? But it was also part of what Larissa Bryan in this chapter calls the social contract. that when women were married, 1600s, 1700s and on in this country, they were considered property of their husbands. So they really had no rights. And so there was nothing called husband rape or spousal rape, wife rape, none of that. Because a wife couldn't be raped by her husband. He owned her. She was his property because he married her. So there was no consent. Boy, it was a terrible time to be a woman. Golly. Consent was for a long time assumed upon marriage. Just assumed. That's something to say, isn't it? I'm looking at page 37, right under the major heading, and right in the middle of that top paragraph, it says, well before the 20th centuries and even into the 20th century, right? It's the 1900s. Sexual consent for women was thought to be given by the nature of the marriage contract in which women became property to men. A woman was perceived as always already saying yes to sex. As a signifier of consent, silence indeed meant yes at the time. So Brian, the author of this chapter, moves us through the tacit or assumed consent and then how that started shifting. One of the most prominent suffragists was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention of 1848, boy, a lot of big stuff happened at that Women's Rights Convention, you can imagine, okay? Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the first one to say that a marriage contract was basically a sanction or an agreement to rape. Imagine what big a statement that was to make in 1848. She's pushing everything and saying, we are not property, we are human beings. We have a will, and we have agency, and we are not your property. And this social contract is terribly oppressive to women, and so women are being subjected to sexual violence against their will all the time, and this has to stop. Radical, radical move by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. For a long time in this country, there was no such thing as spousal rape. Wasn't a term, wasn't talked about, wasn't legal. You didn't have a case. You didn't have a case. Nobody would take your case. In some places, that may still be kind of the thinking. I can't tell you how far Texas has moved on this, but I know we're not as far along in our rape laws as many other states are. I am a native Texan. I'm not critiquing the state of Texas. I have on a Texas flag t-shirt. But we are not particularly forward-thinking about sexual assault and rape when it comes to laws, okay? So, feminism comes along and is trying to bring more agency in the 1960s, 70s, a little bit into the 80s, trying to bring more agency to women and to their right to resist sexual activity and to deny consent, okay? And now where we are, I just want to close here because these tend to go too long because they make me feel like a teacher again. I still feel like a teacher. I just miss my students. So I tend to go too long on these. I'm sorry. So anyway, you can pause and stop them and come back or whatever, or just not listen to it. But anyway, the last thing I want you to understand is something I talked about in one of the other recordings about Chapter 7 in Gender Speak when we talked about affirmative consent. Affirmative consent, I've got to tell you, is not the law of the land in Texas. It is not a national standard. At the time of the printing of this chapter, California was the first and the only state to pass an affirmative consent standard. Affirmative consent says both or all parties, not all sexual activity occurs with just two people. Affirmative consent says all parties must speak their agreement to sexual activity. And not just once, but you have to repeat your agreement, your consent to sexual activity. You don't just have the absence of agreement and assume that the silence means everybody's into it and everybody's agreeing, everybody's consenting. Nope. Affirmative consent is not no means no. It is a more positive thing that says, speak your consent to sexual activity. As a sexual person, speak what you want, what you don't want, where your boundaries are, but speak your consent. It also says, don't use the nonverbals and just think you've got consent because the person didn't run away, or the person wasn't screaming or crying, or the person didn't say no, or the person was drunk or passed out or whatever, and so you didn't hear a no, and so you got all the nonverbals, or you're like, oh, she's into it and she wants me and he was feeling it and all this kind of stuff. All that nonverbal stuff is crap when it comes to consent to sexual activity. You have to speak it. That's why a class like this, sorry, it's self-serving, but a class like this is so important, because I want to empower everyone to figure out in your own style, your own way, how you speak your consent to sexual activity with a partner or partners. I want you to figure out how to do that for you. I can't prescribe how to do that. I'll tell you it's tough. But without clear consent, whole lives are broken. I don't have to tell college students that. Pretty much everybody knows somebody. So affirmative consent is not the standard in Texas. You have an uphill climb if you want to bring a case against somebody that's connected to sexual assault or rape. You will still be grilled about your behavior. Did you bring it on? What did you do? What were you wearing? What were you drinking? Were you taking drugs? Do you know this person? How do you know this person? You will still be grilled about that, and they are very hard cases to prosecute and to win. I hope that at some point in your life you are able to lobby for or vote for an affirmative consent standard for the state of Texas. It will help. Several other states have adopted it. We have not. It is not our law. But I want you to make it your practice. And if a sexual partner doesn't respond well to your affirmation, if you are with a person sexually and the person does not speak affirmative consent, hear me on this. You have to stop. You don't get an affirmative consent. You don't get somebody saying yes to sexual activity. Everything must stop. And I know that is a really hard thing to imagine doing. But whole lives are broken because of these things. You can assume that you have consent and you can go on, and later that person calls it rape. Oh my God, what are we talking about here? That's horrible. So, my dear students, sexual safety is what I'm talking about. I want you to be safe, not just in the way we're hearing that during this pandemic we need to be safe. I want you to be safe that way too, but I want you to be sexually safe. You got to be smart. You got to be communicative. You got to know what you're getting into and be able to speak it. Got to be able to speak it, y'all. Okay. Very heavy subject. I'm going to close. I love you. I miss you. I'm here to help you any way I can. Take care. I'll be back.